Hey there, this is Natalie, and if you're watching this video when it was first uploaded, I hope you're having a great Christmas week. Now this video is one I've been wanting to make for a while, but I was really having trouble figuring out an answer to how time works in the Mushoku Tensei story that I found satisfying, and that was something I said in my last video about Turning Point 4. But having thought some more about it, as a result of some of the comments people left on that video, I now think there is a way to explain how all of the various time-related things in Mushoku Tensei can work together, without creating any strange logical effects that break the otherwise very well thought out world building. I'm going to be talking about that, as well as about why other explanations I've seen put forward, such as anything involving multiverses and parallel timelines, don't make as much sense in terms of Mushoku Tensei's particular story. As a warning, the fact that there is anything strange going on with time at all in Mushoku Tensei is itself a spoiler, and to talk about the various things I need to explain at least my idea about how it could work, I do need to talk about events from well past the anime, and past the translated light novels too, so this video comes with a huge spoiler warning. There will also be some vague, kind of conceptual spoilers for ReZero, but I think even if you haven't seen or read ReZero yet, you're probably already aware that it has time loops in it, given it's part of the whole premise of the show, and I'll try to keep only to the mechanics and not spoil how they affect the plot. There will also be mention of how time travel works in some other stuff like Back to the Future, but I'm hoping that even on YouTube, nobody's going to complain about spoilers for a movie that came out in the 1980s. So, with the spoiler warnings out of the way, first let's set out why time-related stuff in Mushoku Tensei is complicated to begin with, even when compared with other series that have time loops or time travel in them. The period of time we see in Mushoku Tensei, which is Rudeus's 74-year-long life in this world, takes place within a period of 200 years that the dragon god Orsted has been repeating over and over again. Orsted was actually born thousands of years earlier in a separate but connected world called the Dragon World. This was one of 6 connected worlds that made up the Six-Faced World, which is the universe author Rifujin Namaganote created to set Mushoku Tensei and the other related stories in. While Orsted was still very young, Hitagami tricked Orsted's father, the first dragon god, into destroying 4 of the other 6 worlds, leaving behind only the human world, which is where Mushoku Tensei is set, and the dragon world. Then, when the dragon god was weakened, Hitagami fought him, aiming to destroy him and the dragon world too. The dragon god was defeated, and the dragon world did end. But in his last moments, the dragon god managed to seal Hitagami in the void between the worlds, which is the white space we always see him in Rudeus's encounters with him. And, most importantly to this topic, the dragon god managed to use powerful magic the dragon race had been researching to send his son Orsted into the future of the human world. By this magic, Orsted was also set into a loop, where if he died or failed to defeat Hitagami within 200 years of being born in that future, then he'd be reincarnated again, back at the start of that 200 years, with all of his memories from the previous loops intact. So that's Orsted's situation. He's on about his 100th loop when Rudeus meets him in Mushoku Tensei, and this surprises Orsted, because Rudeus has never existed in any of the other loops he's seen. In every other loop, Paul Greyrat only had 2 daughters, Norn and Aisha, and Zenith's first child, Rudeus, was always stillborn. Orsted has also met another person in this loop who's never been around before, and that is Nana Hoshi, the girl from another world who travelled with him. Now, how this came to happen brings us on to the second time-related person in the series, the playback Miko. In the world of Mushoku Tensei, Mikos, or blessed children, are people with very unique special abilities. Zenoba, who we've already seen in the anime, is a Miko with super strength, for instance. Now, because Zenoba is also a prince, he's treated a lot better than most Mikos, who tend to have their names taken away and be referred to for their whole lives only as the Miko, and they get to be used by tools as the country they're born into. A country with a powerful Miko will see this as a game-changing asset, and in the story of the playback Miko, that is certainly the case. She's born quite late into the period of Orsted's 200 years. I'm not using the in-world calendar because it's an extra thing for people who haven't read the books to try to keep track of to follow all of this, but to give you some relative context, she's born a few years after Rudius dies of old age at 74. At the age of 5, she's taken in as a tool for the royal family to use, and her real name, Riria, is forgotten. The kingdom she's used by is never named, but it's very strongly implied by where certain events happen to be the kingdom of Azura, which is a very important country in the political intrigue aspects of Mushoku Tensei, and is also the one Rudius grows up in. The playback Miko's ability is to reset time by up to 24 hours. She can use this to bring dead people back to life and change the outcomes of all kinds of things, so it's understandable that this ability is very precious to the kingdom. But the Miko finds this life of being used as a tool, never having her own name or any friends, and never even being taught about what's going on or about the world around her, to be a kind of hell. Worse still, the Miko keeps being reborn over and over again and living out a similar life. She always goes to work for the kingdom when she's 5, though, and this is important, the ruler and the circumstances of the country are not always the same. And she always dies painfully in various different ways at a young age. She's then born again, remembering everything, including the pain of her death, just to do a different version of it all over again. I'll come to the Miko's final lives in a minute, because that's what causes Rudius and Nanahoshi to end up being isekai'd. But first, I think we can establish a couple of things here that can make the time manipulation going on with Orsted and the Miko work compatibly in the story, before we start adding other elements that make the time stuff more complicated, like Oldius. So, I think it works like this. If we have Orsted's experience of time as one long continuum, which amounts to about 20,000 years at the time he meets Rudius, then that experience is divided into 200-year chunks, where he's basically rolling back everything in the world except his own memory, to a previous save state. The world at the start of that 200-year period is always exactly the same, and the timeline he just lived through no longer exists after he reverts back to that save point. Then we have the playback Miko. While it may seem like the Miko is looping in a similar way to Orsted when she gets reborn over and over again, so doing loops within his loops, which gets pretty messy to think about. Instead, I think she's just born in every one of Orsted's loops, the same as other characters like, say, Zenith or Sylphie, but unlike everybody else, she remembers the things that happened in those past Orsted loops. This includes her own death, where, because she always dies young, this always happens before the end of one of Orsted's loops. The Miko's unique ability to remember timelines that no longer exist is a necessary side effect of her ability to turn back time by up to 24 hours. Because of course, if she couldn't remember ever doing it or why she'd done it, the ability to reset time by a day wouldn't be any use. Equally, if everybody else could also remember what happened before she reset time, then the side using her abilities wouldn't have the same advantages. A side effect of that secondary ability she has to remember timelines she's reset herself is that she remembers her own experiences from timelines Orsted has reset too. Orsted is resetting the world to long before she's born each time though, so that explains why the circumstances of the world when she's born aren't always the same, as they would be if she herself was resetting the world to her own birth like Orsted. Now, why some people are almost always born in every one of Orsted's loops, and often end up doing similar things, is explained in the story by the concept of some people having strong fate, which serves as an explanation as to why things can be quite different in some respects, depending on what happens in different loops, like who ends up ruling a country, for instance. But some people always seem to end up having kids with the same people. You'd think there would normally be a lot of butterfly effect things involved that might prevent a given person who seems kind of random in the story, like say Aisha, being born and named Aisha every time. And yet, even though she's born well into the period of Orsted's loops, when a lot of things have had a chance to change, including even her parents, Paul and Lilia, ever being born, let alone getting together to make her, she almost always exists. The Miko, therefore, is also always born at around the same time and with the same ability, no matter what else has changed from one Orsted loop to another. She always is fated to end up serving the kingdom, whoever rules it. So, to summarise this part, I think Orsted is the only one that's actually resetting the world and his own physical presence in it by a substantial amount of time at any point in Mushoku Tensei. The Miko can reset things too, but only by up to a day, and Orsted, just like everybody else, wouldn't be aware that she's done this. Now, that all fits together pretty well, but then we get to the events of Orsted's current loop, which is the one that Mushoku Tensei covers, and the one where Rudeus is present. At the time Rudeus is born, this loop has already been messed with in the future by none other than the playback Miko. This is fully revealed in the final chapter of the Mushoku Tensei web novel, which is called Prologue 0, and which I go into much deeper in my video about why the mass teleportation incident happened. In this lifetime, the Miko is tasked with something very different than in any other life she's seen. In this timeline, a prophet has told the kingdom that they need to create a magic circle that will summon a hero from another world. It seems like this prophecy is very vague, and any random person from another world will do. The magic circle used to summon this person has been designed to work with the special mana of the playback Miko, and so she's ordered to pour mana into it. When she does this, magic happens and a boy comes through, a boy from our world. She has just basically summoned an isekai protagonist in the form of a Japanese boy named Akihito, who just so happens to be the boyfriend of Nanahoshi, and one of the teenagers Rudeus saved from Truck-kun when he was killed in his old life in Japan. It's kind of ironic really that someone might get rescued from Truck-kun only to instantly be isekai'd anyway. For some reason, perhaps because her magic was used to summon him, the playback Miko can understand Akihito, even though nobody else in this world speaks Japanese, and so she's assigned to be his interpreter. Over time, she falls in love with him, though he doesn't realise this. But the kingdom never taught their summoned hero anything about fighting or battle tactics, and he's just a random Japanese teenager who can't even use magic in this world, where he was summoned rather than reincarnated like Rudeus. He is basically extremely weak, and he dies instantly when he's sent into battle. The playback Miko doesn't know that he's died until more than 24 hours has passed, and so she can't reset time to bring him back. Just like in all of her other lives up to now, she's captured and killed. But because this has been the only life where she's found any happiness or anyone to care about, as she dies, she makes a powerful wish with all that she has, and that wish is that both she and Akihito could live and be together. This wish burns through all of her special powers, and it's strong enough to create a rift in time and space. The intention of the rift is to bring through someone else who also wishes to be together with the same boy, to bring them to the past where they can make preparations so that Akihito might have a better chance in this world. That person summoned is Nanahoshi, his girlfriend, who's taken from our world at the same moment as Akihito. But the rift created by the Miko's wish isn't yet powerful enough to overrule the world itself, and so for 10 years the rift is present in Mushoku Tensei's world, with Nanahoshi contained within itself, fighting against the will of the world itself to put her down there. This can even be seen as the glowing red ball in the sky above the battlefield where Akihito died, a visible sign of the future affecting the past. Now, at the moment in Japan where Akihito is summoned and Nanahoshi is also brought into the rift, past life Rudius, whose name we never find out by the way, has just been killed by the truck, and his spirit, instead of passing on, makes its way into the rift too. Now, because he's just a spirit rather than a whole person like Nanahoshi, he makes it through to Mushoku Tensei's world without the world resisting. The spirit wanders aimlessly to the point where it almost expires, but it eventually finds someone to inhabit, the baby of Zenith Greyrat, who, if you remember, was always stillborn in other loops. This leads to Rudius being born, and then, as Rudius, who's someone who isn't supposed to exist, begins to interact with people with strong fate, such as Roxy, Sylphie and Eris, changing their outlooks on things and then their paths in life, this gradually erodes the world's ability to resist the rift. The red ball in the sky gets bigger, as we see in season 1 of the anime, and then 10 years after Rudius is born, the rift wins. The consequences are the mana calamity that causes the mass teleportation incident, and Nanahoshi arriving into the world at ground zero of that calamity, also known as the site of Akihito's death. So the past has been changed a huge amount by the Miko's wish in the future. That future itself can now never come to be, but certain things in it still have to happen, because the future wish still has a priority over the past, given the things involved in the wish can't have taken place in the past without Akihito and the Miko existing in the future for the wish to actually help. What this means in practical terms is, no matter how perfect her magic circles become, Nanahoshi cannot return to the old world until she's helped Akihito. Also, the Miko will still need to be born in the future in this same Orsted loop, which she is, but this time she's born without her powers, where they were exhausted by the wish. And Akihito will still need to be summoned, though the Miko's rebirth is as far as we get into this final version of the future within Mushoku Tensei. I have a feeling the planned sequel series will start at the point of Akihito being summoned, and he will be the protagonist of that sequel, with Rudius's daughter Lara playing the role of the prophet who ordered the summoning this time around, and Nanahoshi now being heavily involved in the summoning itself. But that's all still speculation until the sequel starts coming out. So, essentially, Orsted's final loop, the one Mushoku Tensei takes place in, has already been modified from the future, and there are a few things in that future that now take priority over the past, and so will need to happen, now perhaps having the very strongest fate of all. That all pretty much works, and without introducing any strange logic or multiverses into the mix. As I said in the intro, I don't think multiverses have anything to do with anything in terms of how time works in Mushoku Tensei, but I really noticed a lot of people going for multiverse explanations for literally every aspect of time manipulation in the story when I said there were things about it I was finding hard to figure out in my Turning Point 4 video. As you can see, to get at least as far as explaining Orsted and the Miko, we don't need to resort to each change to time actually being a jump to another parallel universe, leaving the previous universe with the unwanted outcome still existing and playing out, but now forgotten by the plot. But why was I so reluctant to accept a multiverse answer for this story anyway? Well, a multiverse explanation would be a bad one for both Orsted and the playback Miko, and that's for two reasons. One is an in-world one, and one is a more meta story crafting related one. For the in-world one, both Orsted and the playback Miko are resetting time because other people are forcing them to. In Orsted's case, the original dragon god, his father, put him into a time loop so he would eventually be able to kill Hitagami, who was responsible for the downfall of his entire world, as well as for him causing the destruction of 4 other worlds that he'd otherwise have had friendly relations with. Now, why would the dragon god care about giving Orsted the ability to jump to other parallel worlds, until he eventually defeated Hitagami in just one of them, one that wouldn't be the same one the dragon god had existed in or cared about anyway, leaving behind potentially hundreds of realities where Orsted didn't defeat Hitagami, all of them still existing. If the dragon god believed in multiverses and only cared about Hitagami being defeated in any random one of them, he wouldn't have actually bothered doing any of this. He would have just sent Orsted across to the human world with the other survivors of the dragon race as the dragon world ended, and been able to just die peacefully, knowing that in some reality out there somewhere, Hitagami never existed, and in another, someone else defeated him, and in another, the dragon god had already beaten him in their fight, and so on. Equally, if he'd only been capable of magic that would send Orsted to a parallel world, rather than magic that could put him in a loop that actually reset this reality, the one he cares about, then he would probably have chosen a different magic to use on Orsted to begin with. He'd have known he could only give Orsted one chance to beat Hitagami, so he would probably have focused more on buffing him, rather than messing about with time and reincarnation stuff. As for the Miko and her 24-hour resets, she's always doing this to aid the kingdom. And again, why would a king care about changing the events of the last 24 hours in a reality he will never get to go to, when his reality will remain the same? It just doesn't work. She could be being reborn into different parallel worlds over and over again, which would be a different way to explain why things are slightly different in each of her lives. But given that doesn't account for Orsted or anything else in the story, quite as well as the explanation that he's resetting the world and she just keeps her memories of each failed loop, it doesn't seem like that was the author's idea here. Now, I'll come to reason 2 why a multiverse explanation doesn't really suit this story, which is more from a writing perspective, after talking about Turning Point 4, because Turning Point 4 is, to me at least, the hardest one to explain in terms of what's actually happening to the timelines mechanically, if we assume the explanation about Orsted and the Miko I've given is the correct one. In Turning Point 4, our Rudius encounters an older version of himself, who's sent himself back in time to warn our Rudius basically not to turn out like him. He has a diary that he leaves with Rudius that tells him all of the dark stuff that ended up happening in his timeline, which caused him to basically become a bitter, vengeful killing machine, rather than the primarily pacifist Rudius he had once been. I have a whole video about what's in the diary and how meeting a version of himself from the future affects Rudius, so check that out if you haven't. But what we're most interested in here is the time travel itself. Oldius, which is what we'll call future Rudius, found the way to propel himself back in time via ruins left by members of the dragon race. Old Dragon's Tale gives us the idea that Laplace was leaving things like this relating to dragon race techniques around the world as a way to later help Orsted, so that's probably where they came from, but I won't go into all of that here. The Old Dragon's Tale stuff is explained a lot more in my video about Elena Lisa's secret origins. The type of magic Oldius uses is said to be a kind of time teleportation. So to me, that implies that rather than resetting the whole world and being able to redo things yourself, It would allow you as your current self, along with any objects like diaries that you may want to take with you, to teleport to a different point in time as if it were a physical location. To me, this doesn't suggest it's a different location as in a different dimension in a multiverse, but just a different location in space-time, a different point in causality. Oldius's magic is incomplete, and so when he sends himself back in time to the specific place and time he wants, he brings the diary, but not the lower half of his body and some of his organs. He only has a brief time before dying to say what he wants to say to his past self, and so this is definitely a one-way trip. The point in time Oldius comes from is before the birth of the Miko, and also long before Orsted in that timeline would reset. So this is logically all taking place within the same Orsted loop, no matter how you think Orsted or Miko loops work. Now, this definitely isn't a closed loop, like for instance the one we see in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, where the person travelling back in time will always have been fated to do so. This is because Oldius was never visited by himself from the future in his own past, and so Oldius going back in time doesn't create a situation like the Miko's wish, where certain things seem to be locked in to having to happen in the future. So our Rudius doesn't now have to travel back in time once he gets old. And all that leaves us with really are two options for what the mechanics are doing here. The first is that reality forks here, and on one branch we have a reality where Oldius's timeline happens, and on the other, the one where our Rudius's timeline happens. Basically, going back to multiverses, there's now an existing timeline where Turning Point 4 happens to Rudius and the rest of Mushoku Tensei happens, but there's also still an existing timeline where the events of Oldius's diary play out and he eventually goes back in time, causing Turning Point 4 to happen and this fork to occur. Only, if this is the answer, then we have a problem. This is because that would mean that the branch of reality that Oldius came from still continues on after he leaves. As far as that branch of reality is concerned, he would have just died while using secret time teleportation magic, leaving half of his body behind, and everything else in that reality continues on. That's bleak, considering how dark Oldius's timeline was, but that's not the problem. The issue is that, remember, all of this is taking place within one Orsted loop that began before Rudius was born and ends after he dies. So, if there is a persisting forked reality where Rudius became a monster and then died, we can assume Orsted will fail to defeat Hitagami in that forked timeline later on. Orsted will then reset the world by 200 years, meaning to before Rudius was born, long before that fork in reality happened. And that would mean the other branch of reality, the one we're following in Mushoku Tensei, in which Rudius gets the warning from Oldius and ends up allying with Orsted, increasing his chances of actually winning against Hitagami this time, would also cease to exist. Basically, if Oldius's timeline carries on after he leaves it, this breaks everything logic-wise due to the other time loop stuff that also exists in the story, and that's why I was having such a hard time figuring out how it worked. But then there's the second option. Oldius's time travel is basically more like Back to the Future type time travel. He goes to the past and changes things, and as he does, this affects the future that can exist. As Rudius takes different actions due to having met Oldius, causality changes, and this warps space-time in a way that means the future Oldius comes from is not just no longer inevitable, it's actually impossible. Since Oldius travels to his own past, it doesn't create any paradoxes around him preventing his own birth, and as he dies immediately after doing it, This means the author doesn't have to worry about what would happen to him as things in the past begin to change, or what it would be like if he himself went back to the future. To me, this gives us a way where this final Orsted loop keeps its logical integrity, while also allowing for the Miko, Oldius, and no multiverse shenanigans, and this is the explanation I prefer. But to wrap up, why would those multiverse shenanigans that can be used perfectly well for time-related stuff in other fantasy or sci-fi series have been a bad choice writing-wise for Mushoku Tensei? Well, it's because multiverses can either dramatically raise or dramatically lower the stakes. This is something that's lampshaded very heavily in Season 1 of Rick and Morty, which I won't spoil anything about, but which really poses the question of, if infinite equivalent universes exist, then are the people the protagonists care about in a story interchangeable between universes? To put it another way, does it matter if the Roxy we see survive is Roxy from the same timeline we started the story in? And then, consequently, does it matter about all the Roxys who didn't live in the timeline we're watching, who don't get the better outcomes? For some types of stories, the answer can be yes. The people between one timeline and another are interchangeable. We and the protagonist can instantly switch to caring about the Roxy who's in front of us now, because that's what's relevant to the plot. The fact there are infinite Roxys who are all interchangeable, though, lowers the stakes a lot. If the protagonist who cares about Roxy knows this, and if the ability to travel to other realities in the multiverse continues to be available to them. If this Roxy dies, then the story can just move to another whole universe at an earlier point in time where an equivalent Roxy can be saved, and the universe in which a Roxy died will carry on but be irrelevant to the ongoing plot. At that point, it's a lot less dramatic when any Roxy dies, so this kind of thing would mainly only be used in a story that's low stakes to begin with, perhaps one more about just exploring different possible realities rather than about saving a world or any specific people. Or it can be used to deconstruct the idea of what this would actually do to how someone who could do this viewed the people and world around them, and that's what we see in Rick and Morty. It can also be used in stories where the magic or science used is just generally very soft, and not really supposed to be able to stand up to this kind of scrutiny. This can be fine if that's the feel of the story. It can allow for cool stuff to happen, and it's fine to write fantasy-type fiction with that approach. That's why you won't see me try to explain the logic of anything that happens in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but I still love it. But I think anyone who's read any of Mushoku Tensei will probably agree that it isn't really written in a way that suggests the author doesn't want people to think about the world too much. And I don't think that for this story, a logically broken time magic thing would have been included as just enjoy it and don't overthink it kind of thing. Still, there can be another side to this multiverse thing, where in other types of story, the answer is no. The people in one timeline and another are not interchangeable, and something bad happening in any reality is therefore something bad happening to people we care about. This is explored in ReZero, where Subaru doesn't, to begin with, actually know if he's resetting time or travelling to alternate timelines when his return by death skill kicks in. In Season 2, the idea that all of the realities he died in carried on after his death is one that he's forced to consider. And if that could be the case, he faces the horror of thinking that every time he redoes things in search of the best outcome, he's actually leaving behind whole continuing realities, where not only has whatever bad thing he was trying to prevent happened, but also the people he was close to are left with the consequences of him, say, seeming to have committed suicide. While Subaru thinks the multiverse explanation may be what's happening here, this makes the stakes of every single loop become very high for him, because he doesn't want to leave behind all of these messed up realities. In this sense, whether the Emilia in front of him is the same Emilia he met in the first loop or not, if she or anyone else close to him suffers and it's not all just undone when he dies, then he can't throw lives away by way of experimentation. ReZero plays with this idea to good effect, though in a later arc there is something that makes it possible to assert whether it's a multiverse or a world reset mechanic here, and I won't spoil that. But still, ReZero is all about exploring that kind of mechanic and the effects it has on the hero. Mushoku Tensei is not really a story about time loops or time travel, and is more exploring the reincarnation, second chance at life type side of the isekai premise. This means that, unlike in ReZero, it wouldn't serve the story well for Rudeus to need to be brooding over the fact that realities might still exist out there that Orsted has seen, where he was never born, or that the darkest, most terrible timeline that Oldius comes from will continue to exist, whether he prevents it from happening in the world that he'll experience himself or not. So that's my theory on the various timey-wimey things in Mushoku Tensei, and my thoughts on why this explanation is better than the ones I've seen involving parallel worlds and multiverse type mechanics. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. As always, thank you to my supporters on Patreon who are on screen right now, and thank you to everyone who subscribes to my channel and watches my videos. Thank you for watching this long and complicated one. I hope you found it interesting, and of course, I hope to see you again very soon.